Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to B2B Marketing and Tailoring Your Brand with Edmond Banayan. My name is Colin Mahan, and I'm a program manager at the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center. And for those of you who may not know, the Nasdaq Center is a nonprofit dedicated to enabling entrepreneurs from all over the world to realize their maximum potentials and grow. As you may have just seen in the chat, the Nasdaq Center, along with our partner Mentor Club, launched a free mentor matching platform for entrepreneurs called Mentor Makers. You can create your own advisory board to guide and inspire you with in-the-moment mentorship from topic experts and professionals dedicated to providing exceptional mentorship to entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. So find or become a mentor today by using the link in the chat. Mentorship matters to all entrepreneurs. Their success is dependent on it. Quick housekeeping item, we're going to open up for live Q&A at the end of the event, so please submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. We'll try to get to them all. Now, none of what we do at the center could be possible without all the amazing support from our sponsors, including Nasdaq, Lehigh University, Bank of the West, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodrow Sawyer, BPM, and NZTE. We're humbled by their contributions. Now, during these still unique times, we're curious on how sentiment is among the entrepreneurs we work with. So we're going to start by taking a few polls to let us know how you're doing. So I'm going to launch those. How are you feeling? We've been measuring this since the beginning of 2020, knowing that some of the world is opening up and others are closing down. So if you guys can give us a little bit of that information, that'd be great. Also, we have another poll coming up after this that's going to help our speaker understand where you are and where you're looking to learn. The second question, what's keeping you up at night, helps inform the responsive programming that we deliver, like this one, at the center. So appreciate you guys giving us a moment of your time to vote. But I do want to jump into the discussion. So I'm going to end this poll and share those results. Looks like optimism is at the top of the key, but understand that some of you have a little fear, anxiety, and are just surviving out there. And then sales, marketing, and finance are at the top of our What's Keeping You Up at Night poll. So hopefully you guys will sleep better thanks to our presenter today. Now, finally, before we begin, this question is created to help our presenter understand where you guys are trying to learn today. So appreciate you all giving us a little bit of insight. He will cater his presentation to where you're at. So where are you in the B2B marketing process? Haven't started, here to learn, marketing manually, using free tools and cold emails, using some automation, but want to learn how to scale faster, and then fully set up. So thank you all for voting. I'm gonna end that poll, share those results. Looks like a lot of people are just here to learn, but some people are doing it manually, and some are doing a little bit of automation. So that's amazing. Our presentation today will definitely help those of you looking to learn. So without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome in the chat to our special guest. Edmond Banayan is an executive, a faculty and lecturer, innovation enthusiast. He's a knowledge seeker, and he's also a mentor at the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center. Edmond, welcome. He's coming. There he is, folks. Hello, Edmond.
Well, hello, Colin, and thank you, everyone, for joining today. I took a brief look in terms of the representation that we're having. It seems like we've got a tremendous turnout. We've got not just the United States represented, but other destinations, global destinations such as Albania, Argentina, Singapore, Nigeria, Italy, Canada, Mexico, and much more.
Love that. Well, Edmond, thank you so much, and looking forward to learning more. Over to you.
Thank you. On that note, that has actually some interesting implications about our discussion today. One of the things that I'm sure you all have had to sort of balance and think about is this notion of diversity, this notion of you got a lot on your plate. And something that comes to mind that I think it impacts us, all of us, whether we have a bootstrap company, an early stage company, seed stage, series round or a more established company that has cash flow and revenues. It is the factors of time, resources, money, and capital. I'd like you to keep that in mind as we continue with our dialogue, because these three elements is something that's just not going to impact our discussion today, but it's going to impact all of us, irregardless of how big, small, large, or where our companies are at. It is essentially a balancing act. And one of the most toughest things you have to do is to balance this. That is, when you're an early stage company, if you bootstrap or you're early stage or seed stage and so on and so forth, oftentimes you guys have plenty of time on your hand. But in terms of your access to money and capital and resources, you don't have as much. And then as we move along this paradigm, and then you get to the other end where the company that you're at, you're more established, you have revenues, good cash flow, and number of employees, then all of a sudden things sort of change, right? It's no longer you have ample time and limited cash and resources and funding, but rather now things change, right? Now you kind of have very little time on your hand, lots of potentially, ideally, cash, capital, and resources. But again, if you think about it, it affects all of us to a different degree. Why am I sharing this with you? Well, I'd like you to imagine the need and the possibility of having access to something that gives you control over this. Something that de-risks this component that I just shared with you. And by de-risking that, you can have greater control and management and outcomes and return on investment for not just your B2B marketing, but other parts of your business. This is very relevant to our discussion today as we want to talk about how do we optimize and maximize our business-to-business marketing campaigns and ultimately achieve the greatest return on investment. With that in mind, we're going to transition into this notion of the balancing act, and we're going to discuss these companies that you see in front of you. And each of these companies has had this at their hand, has had this at their discretion, in that they've got this balancing act between time, resources, and capital and funding. And here's what you find ideally among all of these companies that you see in front of you. Every single one of these companies has had an event where they had a breakthrough.
Hey, Edmond, I can't see your screen. Would you mind trying to share it again? Sorry, I was like, oh, this is a great lead into the slides. And then I realized.
Thank you so much. Oh, I apologize. Yes.
All good.
Let me do a screen share. Oh, all righty. You guys can see my screen now, I gather.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
My apology for that. Essentially, I was referring to earlier, we got this balancing act going on here where you want to balance that given everything that's going on with your business. And ultimately, now we've reached a point where this balancing act, you see these companies in front of us now, all of them are household brands. Many of us have heard of them, whether it's CPK, California Pizza Kitchen, which was a client of mine a couple of decades ago, whether it's Apple, Hotmail, Dollar Shave Club, Dropbox. Every single one of these companies has had an event, what I call an uncontrollable event, that has allowed them to have this breakthrough, that essentially allowed them to manage that balancing act that we talked about, where time and resources and money essentially begins to equalize. But, is this something you would want, where it's uncontrollable and you have to rely on something that's uncontrollable? In other words, a growth hack, such as what these guys have experienced? Or do you want to do something where you have more control over it and you're not just relying on a growth hack campaign like many of these companies have executed? Let me give a little bit of example behind this before we get into the meat of our discussion for the day. In 1996, Hotmail, the company that you see in front of you, was arguably the first company to conceive of this term that we all know about today, and that is growth hacking, or for that matter, marketing hacking, right? And so on and so forth. 1996, Hotmail was the very first company, by many accounts, to conceive of this. In doing so, within an 18-month span, where they executed a growth hack campaign inspired by Tim Draper, the billionaire angel investor, who essentially went to management and said, hey guys, why don't we, we're being out competed by the bigger companies. They're putting up billboards, advertisements, so on and so forth. And we have little or no money we can put into marketing. Why don't we do something creative, something different to drum up some of that traction? What they did on the most basic realm, they essentially said, hey, we've got this mailing platform, email platform. Let's, in every single bottom, on the bottom of every email, let's include a little note. And this was proposed by Tim Draper to the management. Let's put this little note on the bottom. And I quote, P.S. I love you, period. Get your free email at Hotmail, period. And let's send that out and see how that's going to drum up some traction and get us more users. Well, management pretty much accepted his suggestion, except they took out the I love you sign and they put get your free email at Hotmail. That was what we call a breakthrough event, a disruption of sort that essentially within an 18-month span, Hotmail went from 0 users to upwards of 12 million users. And shortly thereafter, the company got acquired for $365 million. But is that the only thing that led to their success, right? Did this uncontrollable event where it viraled and you had this networking effect of marketing and users and, I email you and 2 other friends and then you guys email 10 people and then those 10 people email 20 and this networking viral effect happens where it blows up. Is that the ideal way to run the business? Is that the ideal way to just rely on a growth hack such as that? Or can we do something else where it's more controllable, right? Ideally, in an ideal world, as leaders, we need to run the business in a way where we have those uncontrollable factors, but also we need to have something more controllable, a system, a process that is more controllable, where it's more strategic, and we can iterate, and essentially tee it up for little or no mistakes and ultimately get the highest return on investment, in our case, for the business-to-business marketing campaigns. So we want a mix. The answer is a mix of both. We want some uncontrollable factors such as that, where we can be very fortunate and it can blow up and we become a household brand name, and then we get acquired for millions and millions of dollars. But we also really need to run it like a business and have something more strategic, systematic by how we do our marketing. I share that with you because all the other companies you see in front of you, they have had similar stories. And many of them, after Hotmail, began to execute similar type of quote unquote cracking the code when it comes to hacking to get this optimal burst of users or customers. But that is not the way we want to ultimately rely on our marketing and our ability to develop traction for our business. So that leads us to our discussion today. The discussion today that we're going to have, it's more about, okay, we know that this world of hacking or cracking the code or for that matter, a breakthrough, right, or a disruption can exist and it's available to us. But we also want to learn and identify systematic ways by which we have a solid foundation from a marketing standpoint and strategic standpoint, that we have that foundation, and then we keep tapping into that foundation's toolbox, that foundation's framework when it comes to our marketing operations and department in this case, which is our discussion today. And then we want to keep iterating. In other words, what I mean by iterate, keep perfect it and make it better and build on it until we get to a point where there's little or no inherent systematic risks or mistakes. And then ultimately that leads to greater returns on investment when it comes to our B2B marketing campaign. With that, I'd like us now to sort of share with you a little bit about our game plan, kind of what our agenda is for the day. We're gonna begin with some high-level introductory discussion around the brand and its objectives. From there, we'll go talk about what distinguishes, a B2B marketing campaign and its objectives, so that we have some correlation and foundation between these two pieces and how they interrelate ultimately. And then from there, we'll continue on, and then we'll try to identify value add and is identifying how we can differentiate things and what differentiation and value add means to us in terms of having a more relevant and effective B2B marketing campaign. From there, we'll talk about B2B and integrated MarCom for higher ROI. From there, I plan to share with you all some tools and techniques that will enable you to have this big picture strategic vision and outlook about B2B marketing and how you can tap into this sort of framework and thinking around that in order to optimize and maximize your return on investment when it comes to your B2B marketing efforts. And again, we'll go back and sort of revisit these companies that I just shared with you a little bit more and sort of dig in a little bit more about some of the discussion that we had prior to that. And then we'll conclude the day with some concluding thoughts and some takeaways from everything we discussed today. With that, sort of the basics, right? We want to build the basics around, and one of the things, by the way, as a little side note, it's a little disclaimer, we have a very broad audience, as I shared with you earlier. So one of the things I like to try to achieve is to kind of create a little framework right off the bat where we can somewhat all of us be on the same page as we move through the dialogue. So I plan to spend a little bit, not so much time on the high level discussion around branding and B2B marketing, but just to establish some foundation for all of us so that we can build on. The essence of branding and brand equity is to build what a company maintains a positive association with the brand in the mind of the consumer. I'd like you to not lose sight of that, the mind of the consumer. And this, by the way, is not just relevant to B2B, but it's also relevant to B2C, B2E, and B2G. Oftentimes, people believe name, terms, signs, and symbols are sort of a brand, right? But in actuality, it's not. A brand is something uniquely different. Let me try to encapsulate it for you. 2 words describe a brand. It's a promise. A brand is a promise. It's 2 words. It's easy to say. But as you'll see, and I'm sure many of you have experienced, to deliver on that promise, the why about your brand, not the what, not the how, not the where, but the why of your brand that resonates with your target audience and ultimately who you're going after. That is a tough code to hack. But for those that do, such as Apple, it reaps tremendous return on their investment. But just keep in mind, it's about a promise. Brand equity, what you see in front of you now are number of criterias by which you can consider in terms of measuring when you're running the campaign, the elements of your brand equity. As the case with anything else, you need to have objectives, right? In the world of brand building and brand equity, just at a high level for you all to know and make a mental note of, and then of course look into it as your needs dictate. There are 9 different types of brand objectives. And what you see in front of you, these objectives are the areas as you build your campaign, you want to hone in on them in order to maximize and grow them and increase them and improve their metrics over time. The takeaway here is effective planning can lead to better results and higher marketing ROI when it comes to these objectives. Now let's shift gears and talk a little bit about B2B marketing. Again, we don't want to get too much into these things because frankly, oftentimes these are something much more detailed. But again, we want to touch on a high level so that we're all on the same page and we can tie in branding and B2B marketing and ultimately build on it as we go further in this discussion. The essence of B2B marketing, it's really about establishing a process whereby you can add value directly to your B2B customers. Similarly, establishing your value add and differentiation when it comes to B2B marketing. Again, the process comes into place. It's about the process, the process, the process. So then the question is, why the need to add value, right? And differentiate. Answer to that is your demand as a B2B provider is derived from your B2B customers, B2C customers. In other words, it's a couple of steps ahead. If your B2B customers do not have the adequate amount of demand and traction, that's going to trickle down to your business. So what does that mean? What's the implications? The implication for us is, as you guys consider and plan for your B2B strategy, campaign, and execution, you not only need to know about your B2B customers, but you also need to investigate and learn about their B2C customers, because ultimately the livelihood of their B2C customers impacts your livelihood. So then let's talk about why do we need to be a value-add B2B partner. I'd like us to now go through an example together a little bit so you can see it visually, how this notion of needing to add value to your B2B partners is mission critical. Here's an example of a company that is building apparels, shirts, pants, and the like. What you see in front of you is essentially their value add chain. The chain starts from, the raw material, that is the cotton, and then it spans all the way to apparels and t-shirts. What you see with apparels and t-shirts, you've got a finished product. And then what you see with the cotton, obviously it's a raw material, and then it keeps getting added to it, right? There's all these other pieces in between that come into play whereby the value add can happen for your customers, right? As this happens, what is essential to keep in mind is the key distinction here on the left side, what you see versus what you see on the right side. What you see on the left side is all these features: low design, less customization, little or no value add, high price sensitivity, lower brand equity, and it's a commodity for all practical purposes. And then once it becomes a finished product, obviously, right, you see all those things kind of turn 360, right? You got a higher brand equity, it's a premium purchase, and then the design element and customization, of course, has been increased as well. Then the question for us is, what are the implications of this? Well, the implications are pretty significant. If done right, the implications are we can establish a strategic differentiation if we are able to manage this pipeline, and that adds value not only to our B2B customers, but also to determine a mechanism, a partnership, strategic alliance, so on and so forth, whereby we can add value to their B2C customers. In other words, we will be able to better differentiate our business as a B2B provider than the competition. And the value add that we provide, of course, will be higher. But now that we established, B2B campaigns or marketing and some of the key considerations that go into that, and we also talked about branding and the 9 objectives pertaining to branding and how brand is really a promise, and living up to that promise and achieving that promise is far more difficult than just saying it's a promise. Now that we sort of build that framework, we want to talk about now something within this realm that can be a very, very advantageous strategic tool and arsenal in your back pocket. That is integrated marketing communication. What is integrated marketing communication? Essentially, guys, it is a novel sort of cutting edge discipline, tool, and system whereby we can build our brand equity and ultimately build out very relevant, customer-centric type of B2B marketing campaigns, which, by the way, on a side note, we can do for B2C and B2E as well. On a high level, what's the essence of integrated marketing communication? The essence of it is essentially what we call the sweet spot. And we'll get a little bit more into that a little bit later. But just to give you a little glimpse, once we achieve that sweet spot, there's greater return on investment, there's less risk, there is greater success that comes with our marketing campaigns by achieving the sweet spot, quote unquote. The planning and role of the four Ps, that is price, promotion, placement, and product, is intertwined with integrated marketing communication. In other words, what I'm describing to you here, it's one and the same. You got to think about all the 4 Ps. Actually, there's about 6 Ps now, but traditionally we refer to as the 4 Ps, and now in the world that we're in, it's more of 6 Ps. But whether it's 4, 5, or 6, it's all interconnected, intertwined with your integrated marketing campaign. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And as I said earlier, this notion of integrated marketing communication is something, it's a discipline, it's a toolbox, it's a system that you can apply not just to your B2B customers, but also B2C and B2E. So now we want to talk a little bit more about sort of the techniques and the tools and the philosophy and the strategy and the execution as it pertains to integrated marketing communication and B2B marketing. What you see in front of you is a illustration I created, whereby I sort of try to bring everything together for you guys. And my objective and goal is to essentially give you the glimpse that this is on a high level as you're thinking about your respective B2B marketing campaigns and how you want to execute to achieve the optimal execution, optimal ROI and success, you need to consider all of these pieces as they go together. I'm going to blow right through them and just know that there's, for any one of these, there are oftentimes 1 or 2 classes that could be taught, or for that matter, seminars and the like, just for any one of these particular topics. But I'm just going to give you a quick glimpse about all of them real quickly. Brand contact audits. I will share this with you. It is an essentially significant tool. It is one of those things that you must do as a business, because if you don't, you're going to notice some inefficiencies and some problems coming your way down the road. Consumer research, profiling, segmentation, and targeting. That's really it's fundamentals when it comes to marketing and also B2B marketing. You've got to do your consumer research, and then you've got to profile, then you've got to segment out the audience that you're going after. You've got to put them into segment, and then you've got to devise certain strategy and execution by which you target them, and you do the acquisition of those customers and the retention and the cross-selling and upselling and so on and so forth. From there, there's that element of features, benefit, willingness to buy, and the sweet spot. We just talked about the sweet spot. The sweet spot is sort of an interconnected web of many of the things that we're talking about here. But oftentimes you will find marketers will just look at things and say, oh, these are my features, right? And we spell out the features on our website. But in reality, features are not what should be driving your B2B marketing campaigns. Neither is benefits. It is really the sweet spot and the value proposition that should be driving how you build and strategize and plan for your B2B campaign to be executed. And then the features and the benefits and other elements are really a byproduct of that. And then we talk about customer lifetime value. Customer lifetime value is something, and in our case, being B2B customer lifetime value, but it's often something that most businesses don't practice. But in actuality, they should, because marketing is not just about qualitative elements, but it's also about quantitative. And in an ideal world, you need to bring them both together. Qualitative and quantitative, bring them together and be able to measure things, feed back into that loop, the feedback you're getting. And again, as I said earlier, iterate until you've perfected the system. Customer lifetime value is a piece of that. And essentially with customer lifetime value, it's a phenomenal thing. I actually performed this and utilized it for one of the companies that I shared with you earlier. That was among the balancing image and visual that you saw, California Pizza Kitchen. Apply this customer lifetime value measurement. And essentially, it's a way by which you attach a dollar value to any given customer, to a given customer within segments. And that is essential because it will give you insight from a quantitative standpoint that you've never had. And you can build on that. And then from there, we go what's called the strategy and the 80-20 principle and the execution. You've all heard of probably the 80-20 principles, and there is different iterations of that. There's 90-10 principle, 80-20 principle, and it's applied to various metrics of the business, whether it's profitability, revenues, so on and so forth. But really, what the essence of it here, what we're trying to say is the following. You will implement principles such as the 80-20 principle. You will implement that in different types and shapes. And the ideology behind the 80-20 principle is really it's an allocation of resources mechanism. You guys remember early on, we talked about those three things, right? Time, resources, money, and capital. These three things, regardless of where you are in your business, you can have these deviations between them, right? The 80-20 principle is a way and a mechanism by which you can optimize that dynamic, as we talked about, right? And maximize the return on the money that you're putting into a campaign, and optimize your time you put into it, right? And ultimately, the next step being, you got to build out your value proposition. You got to know what your value proposition is when you go to market, when it comes to whether it's a B2B campaign or B2C campaign or so on and so forth. You got to build out that value proposition. Now we came back to that discussion around Hotmail, Dropbox, CPK, Apple, all these companies. And what do they all have in common? Irregardless of the uncontrollable event that we talked about that provides every single one of these companies, it provided all these companies a breakthrough, right? Whether it was Hotmail or it was Dropbox or Apple. What is that element? And really, it really comes down to this thing that we call sweet spot that we referred to earlier. The sweet spot, if done right, similar to this particular illustration, if the sweet spot is done right, you inherently receive a higher ROI on your B2B marketing campaign, because ultimately through the sweet spot, you are going after the why. The why as to why people want to buy at Apple, not the what of what Apple is about, not the how of Apple, but the why. Why people want to buy an Apple. Well, there's an element that connects to people, connects Apple's customers and communities to the brand, and that is the why of the sweet spot. Now we sort of want to have some takeaways around our discussion today. Building brands and branding matters. Why? Because the more equity you build into your brand, the more you can do with that. Integrated marketing communication is applicable for your B2B marketing campaigns and achieving a higher ROI. As leaders, as business owners, as collaborators, as marketing leads, leveraging your principles, the principles we talked about earlier, and the tools and the systems to hack your growth, it should be considered in conjunction with just, as many have done, growth hacking, where it's somewhat of an uncontrollable event because you really don't know how people are going to viral with that, how they're going to embrace you creating a certain video, right? A creative video that takes off. That can be a little bit out of your control sometimes, but having the principles, the tools, the systems, the practice internally within your organization is something within your control, and therefore you can de-risk your business by having both. Similarities and overlaps exist, as we talked about earlier, among B2C, B2B, B2E, and B2G. And, I would say champion and empower your marketing teams, leaders, to try to identify that sweet spot. Because in doing so, for every dollar you'll be spending on your B2B marketing campaign, you can rest assured you'll have a higher return rest assured you get a higher return on that investment with greater certainty. Implementing it as well. And ultimately, and last but certainly not least, think creatively, resourcefully, and strategically. And I think we developed that example early on in terms of why it's significant in terms of the success of your business. And on that note, thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Amazing. Thank you, Edmond. All righty. Guys and gals, time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, drop them into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Edmond, thank you so much for that presentation. Let's jump right into it. We do have a couple of pre-submitted questions, so we're going to roll in to some of those. And then everyone else in attendance, if you guys have any questions for Edmond, just drop them in the box and we'll hopefully get to all of them. So Edmond, to start us off, what are the best practices for B2B marketing on LinkedIn?
Great question. It's LinkedIn is sort of a creature of its own in some ways because it has been a little bit crowded now. There's ample players that are getting on LinkedIn and trying to vie for people's businesses. And frankly, one of the things now it's becoming alarming and concerning is a lot of your B2B leads that you're going after on LinkedIn. They're beginning to just hit the delete button, and they will delete your messages when they drop in their inbox. And in some ways, that's looked upon now as intrusive. And the last thing you want to do as a B2B campaigner and marketer, you want to avoid intrusive outreach and execution, right? So the more ideal practice on LinkedIn that will bring you more of their attention, right, and bring you more of more success is going the non-obtrusive route. And that is essentially, engage on certain groups, begin to participate, get your brand out there, right? Whether it's commenting on things, liking things, sharing relevant content on LinkedIn, relevant, so on and so forth. And as you do that, then you will notice with more repetition, more frequency of outreach on LinkedIn through unobtrusive ways, right? You will notice that your brand and your brand identity begins to pop up more in people's top of the mind, right? So I would advise the best mechanism on LinkedIn is avoid the sort of the obtrusive approach that's available where you can reach out to people in a cold way, but rather look for more quote unquote warm avenues and paths and techniques whereby you can build relationships and get engaged on a dialogue that's relevant to your target audience.
That's super helpful. We've got a question from Anita, just real quick. They were asking what's B2E?
Thank you for that question. B2E stands for business to enterprise.
Yep, awesome. Let's see, another question from Rachel. Thanks for the question. What type of software do companies use who target B2B or B2G? For instance, if I have a large list with 800 companies on it, they want to keep track of who they emailed. Yeah,
so essentially you're referring to a CRM platform, and there are many players out there. Oftentimes, the one that has sort of the greatest share of mind and share of market across all verticals and business sizes is Salesforce. But there are other competing products in addition to Salesforce out there. I would probably, I don't want to necessarily get into the business of promoting one over the other, but what I would say is there's plenty of literature out there, and quite frankly, I'm aware of as well, that they will give you the nice breakdown in terms of which CRM platforms and systems you should consider, and they will do a fascinating job for you to compare and contrast their features, pricing, and ultimately customer service support. So I think if you do some research out there, in addition, I would also recommend talk to your colleagues who have them as well, who have implemented them in their organization as well, and then marry those two data points to make your decision.
That's awesome. And yes, also there are a lot of low cost, if not free, tools for lists that small. So I love that what you said, Edmond, about not wanting to plug one particular one, but yeah, I think MailChimp's pretty free at that point, but there are a lot to do. Just do a little research, and I'm sure you'll be able to find some to be able to track that. Because again, you want to sharpen your marketing sword. Data is really, really important. When you okay, got another anonymous question. When you refer to an element of the Apple brand has a connection to communities in the instances of B2B, do you think the why as an element of the brand has a connection to the targeted businesses?
Absolutely. You know, so it comes down to first establishing the why, right? As to why people should get Apple products, right? But here's the thing, guys, after that, and gals, after that, then it comes down to really taking that why that you've discovered, the sweet spot as it pertains to the why, right? And then you've got to do some customization of your own, right? For your own customer base. Consider what vertical you're in. Consider the patterns of behavior for that B2B customers you're going after, right? Where they're at, how you can reach them, their pattern of behavior, so on and so forth. And then you need to customize your why to their profiles, right? For any one of those segments. But the exercise really on a high level, it's not about determining what is Apple. It's not about determining how Apple does things, right? It's not about determining where Apple does things, but it's really about determining why Apple is what it is, right? And what is its unique value proposition and brand promise.
Love that. And there was a question that was asking, they understand the why of B2B marketing, but they wanted to know a little bit more about the how. So hopefully that one helped that. And if you have a follow-up, just let us know in the Q&A box.
I can add, if I may add maybe a little bit more to that. I would say if you were to prioritize from a marketing standpoint, right? I mean, a business standpoint, the utmost priority and importance goes to the why. And then from there, you can put relevant priority to, the how, the what, the where, and the when, and so on and so forth.
So another question around B2B, and this is, I think, on the qualification stage. How do I identify if the person they're selling to is the decision maker, i.e. the economic buyer?
Yeah, that's more of a tactical question, but I'd be happy to comment on that. So there's a number of ways, we can all do that. Some of that is publicly available to us through various databases, and of course, sophisticated query searches online. But in addition to that, I think you can also even implement simple mechanisms such as really reaching out to the company and finding out their contact information, right? And then make some phone calls and just talk to different people and find out who the decision maker is, right? Another way you can do that too is if you happen to know and have a relationship with, I think this might be the best way, right? In terms of finding out the decision maker at a given company, but tap into your network, tap into your connections, right? And your connections, right? Tap into that and find out from them who is the potential decision maker, and then ask them and inquire and see if they're willing to make an introduction. Even if it's just a basic introduction saying, I'm reaching out to a company, I'm saying, hey guy, hey company X, Colin is a friend of mine and he's got a new business going on. I think you might be interested in his service. I'll leave it up to you guys to take it from here, right? It can be as simple as that. But that introduction, finding someone that can make that introduction, I think can be significantly valuable to finding that decision maker.
Super helpful. And also advice that I've heard around that same question on identifying the economic buyer is, sounds obvious, but asking whether or not they have a budget for software or whatever the service or whatever the product is. I wouldn't have that in the first line of the introduction, but I think, most people are open to sharing whether or not that they are the person in charge of purchasing, procurement, and software acquisitions. Let's see, we've got a question on creating value props. Is there a secret to this, or is it tweaking the obvious?
Well, I think I'll go back to that illustration that I put together. Before you get to the value proposition, you've got to go through all those other exercises that I outlined for you, right? And ultimately, all those other exercises give you quantitative and qualitative data points that you can marry and bring together to ultimately build out your value proposition, right? Building out the value proposition in terms of its construct and just writing it out, I think that probably is the least of your concerns, because that is something you can identify and do by just learning about it, right? Writing it out is the least of your concern, but really the trick of the trade is, the secret sauce is everything else that precedes it and all the other things you do to build into really finding the right value proposition, not just any value proposition, but the right.
Yeah. And getting feedback, right? You were talking about the iterative processes. So see what resonates with people. And if it isn't, then maybe you need to go back to the drawing board a little bit. But don't test out the early days with really important accounts.
Yeah. Really solid point there, Colin. Here's a little technique you all might want to consider when it comes to the process of iterating. And we talked about earlier, you need to sort of iterate to master what is the sweet spot for you to land on, right? So one things you can do, like let's say if you're an early stage company, or for that matter, you're just doing a new marketing campaign, you can break that down into 3 different, for example, 4 or 5, but the standard is 3 different buckets of release. The first bucket of release is you will have a private validation program where it's sort of, you identify a private small group of people, right? And then you roll out that campaign. And then when you roll out that campaign, you can test out many things, including your value proposition, right, to that private validation group. From there, you can go to a more exclusive validation group, right, for your second release of sorts. And in that exclusive validation group, you can open it up more, right, where you can actually not just have the people that you had in your private validation testing, but also you can now add some of your customers, right? Some of the alpha or beta customers, if you're in the digital world, you can add it to that. And then now you've got another iteration where you open up your campaign or your product or your platform and you test it, you break it, you test it, you break it, you learn, and you implement enhancements and improvements. Then the third one would be the one that you would essentially open up to the public, that third release or validation phase. You open that up to the public because by the time you reach that third phase or that third release, you have done enough iteration and improvements and refinement to bring a good, solid product to the market that is going to be relevant. And you have to make sure, and I'm going to underline the word relevant to your target audience.
Super helpful. Let's see, another question. Besides ROI, what key performance metrics are beneficial to keep in mind when marketing for B2B?
Great question. It really, actually, excellent question. It's not just about the ROI, the money you can make on those campaigns, right? But you've got to consider other metrics and measurements in addition to that, right? Such as user or customer satisfaction with your product, right? If it's a product, for example, that can have defects, measuring those defects, measuring the number of failures of the product. Let's say if it's a tech product, right? How many times it's crashed, so on and so forth. You got to measure all the other elements. So I would say, it's one of those things I can't specifically give you a very specific answer because it would depend from business to business and industry by industry. But depending on your industry and the type of business you have, just make sure you identify metrics beyond the overall return on investment for your campaign, right? Look at the other intangible factors and considerations, right? Such as user satisfaction, user repeat business and returns, and so on and so forth. Yeah,
I think it depends, but understanding those metrics before you release the campaign is also important.
And that's when, by the way, if in that illustration, on the upper right-hand corner, you guys may remember this was a particular box where we talked about, marketing research, right? Profiling, segmentation, all that stuff, right? That is where you want to make sure you do your primary and secondary research. In your primary and secondary research, you can test out, by the way, and identify what other metrics besides your ROI you need to implement in your marketing dashboard, right? You can identify. So you can do that through a focus group, through questionnaires, and so on and so forth. But that is where you want to identify what else besides ROI you need to include in order to ultimately have the highest customer lifetime value associated with your customers.
Love that. Lifetime value is the key. Well, we're almost out of time. And so sorry if we couldn't get it to you guys' questions, but Edmond, thank you so much for sharing some of your treasure of knowledge and insights with our community today. On behalf of everyone on our team and everyone in attendance, really appreciate you sharing some of this B2B and branding information with our community. For those of you who are still on, we've got some cool events coming up in the coming weeks, so don't miss out. We've got Show Me the Money and How to Start a Business, start a Profitable Business with Dr. Carrie Yazid. And then also we've got Cultivating Your Trifecta Tribe of Mentors, Peers, and Mentees in Business with Michelle Talbert. So thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to welcoming you back online soon.